This is Tecker 101, episode 97, OpenID.
Hi, I'm Reed Dame.
And I'm Michael Plasmeier.
Today we're going to be looking at OpenID. If you're always tired of remembering a whole bunch of passwords and usernames, this website aims to solve that problem.
Right, but it's not a website, it's sort of like a decentralized protocol. What OpenID is trying to be is a decentralized single sign-on system. Single sign-on systems were tried in the past, notably Microsoft's Passport, which never expanded much farther than their own sites, because no one wanted to rely on Microsoft to use theirs. But OpenID is coming back. It's not really sort of totally practical in use now completely. It may be so more in the future. Basically it means that you use a password for one particular site to log on to a different site. So the first thing you need is an OpenID provider. These are people who will do the authentication for you, the set of passwords that you use. A lot of big sites are becoming OpenID providers, and AOL, Yahoo, and Google are all OpenID providers, meaning you can use their username and password to log on to other OpenID sites. A fourth one is the VeriSign PIP service, pip.verisignlabs.com. If you have a PayPal token that we talked about in episode 47.
That's a little electronic device that automatically gets a number, and you type that in, and it's a secure way to log in.
Right, this is a second factor authentication. This is a big use for OpenID, perhaps in the future, where you'll have a logon provider like VeriSign Labs, where you log on with a username and password, but also a temporary 6-digit code. This temporary 6-digit code is only valid for 30 seconds, meaning if your account to be hacked, they would have to have both your username, your password, and the 6-digit code. Again, only valid for 30 seconds, and then it'll change. So they could only hack your account if they, got your 6-digit code and applied it immediately, and then they'd only have access once. So, maybe in the future, maybe some sort of biometric thing, fingerprint reader or eye scan or something. I don't know, whatever biometric service might be an additional factor that you use as part of an OpenID provider to log on to any website. So a website would just support OpenID. It wouldn't have to support the PIP token, the biometrics, and each different type of biometric. It would just support OpenID, and then the OpenID provider, the one whose password you're using, could require and support additional authentication tools like the PIP or the fingerprint reader or something. So where you can use your OpenID to log into. Facebook and Dig are two of the OpenID relying parties. Those are sites you can use your OpenID to log into. For instance, Basecamp, which we talked about in episode 96. Instead of using your username and password, you can click log on using OpenID instead, and then it will give this box. So what you do with this box is you type in your OpenID URL. This is the original way OpenID was designed, is that the provider would give you a URL. For instance, for VeriSign Labs, it's username.pip.verisignlabs.com. So I could actually use that. For example, I could go theplas.pip.labs.com. I think that's right. Then we hit sign in, and then it's going to redirect me to VeriSign Labs, where I'm going to log on with my username and password. And then I'm going to type in my security code. So the website wanted to use my username, and we're going to allow it to use my username. So now it returned, and I haven't set up OpenID. If I have to link, this is the thing, is that OpenID is not really right now an account you can use to log in everywhere. Instead, it's just like something you can use to log into your account. So you have to, for example, on Basecamp, you have to make a regular Basecamp account and then associate it with an OpenID. So it's kind of like an additional logon factor. So if I had done that association, I would have been logged in, and I would have used that one VeriSign Labs password and token instead of having a separate password for Basecamp. Sites may also be able to request and send along credentials. For example, Project Path or Basecamp could have asked for my address and my phone number, and if I had typed those into VeriSign Labs would prompt me, do you want me to send, along with the authentication information to Project Path, do you want me to send your address and phone number? So that way I wouldn't have to type it in, and I could choose allow or deny. Some sites, when supporting OpenID like Facebook, they won't sort of have this the OpenID URL. Instead, what they'll have is they'll have the OpenID URL in the corner, but what they'll have is they'll have big logos for the OpenID providers: AOL, Google, VeriSign Labs, Facebook, and then you click on the logo, and then it will sort of automatically redirect you to that particular provider's OpenID site, so you don't have to bother about using OpenID URLs. And I think that's sort of the future where things are going, to support these logos. It's kind of, the open source purists are not really happy about it. They like using this OpenID URL because, and that's the way Basecamp does it, because Basecamp doesn't have to know that Google is an OpenID provider. They don't care that Google is an OpenID provider, because you can just type in any OpenID URL right there and it works. Instead of each site having to, each site saying, oh, I know Google is an OpenID provider, so I'll add them to a list, and that's sort of playing favoritism. But it is easier for people to log into other sites using that.
Yeah, right now OpenID isn't really, like, I wouldn't say it's good to use. Like, once they add more sites and make it easier to use, and maybe remove this typing in the URL,
yeah,
then you'll have the day where you can just have one username and password for the entire internet.
And in addition to a username and password, a third-factor authentication, like a token or a biometric or something, so you'd have even more security. So if someone got your password, you aren't in a problem.
One problem right now with OpenID is if you have your OpenID account linked to your email account, your Facebook account, all your accounts, and then someone sees you typing in your OpenID password or somehow otherwise gets it, then they have access to everything. It's not like they just have access to your Facebook. They have your email, maybe even your online banking, and that's really bad. So that's why you want something like this security chip,
right,
or a fingerprint, or something like that to make sure that there's an additional authentication.
So OpenID, it's something to look forward to in the future, perhaps more. Yeah, a big limitation is, like, you can't just log in using OpenID. You have to associate it. You have to make a normal account and then associate with your OpenID, which is kind of like the why bother.
Yeah, I just use the same password for everything, and that works just fine.
Yeah, that's probably a worse idea, but I think when they add when you start using it with a third factor or a biometric, and more sites allow it, then I think it definitely has the power to take off. Reminder, OpenID, it's not a password. You don't have an OpenID password. You have a password from a provider like Google or AOL or Yahoo, and then you use that password from the provider to log on to a particular site, a relying party, which is a site that you use, the site that you log into, which is Facebook or Dig are examples of that. So you probably already have sort of an OpenID ready account from Google or from Yahoo or from AOL that if you see the OpenID, an OpenID picture, maybe you could try it, or maybe you'll see the words. Probably what's going to happen is you'll see that logo thing. So it could say create an account or log in with your Google account. And although you might not be knowing it, it's using OpenID behind the scenes. So maybe that's where the future of OpenID is. I'm Michael Plasmeier.
I'm Reed Dame.
Look around for OpenID. To watch this episode again or to watch any of our prior episodes, you can visit our website 911.tecker.net, T-E-C-K-E-R. And on the website we have our prior episodes, as well as you can view them directly on the website, or you can download them in WMV for Windows, iPod or QuickTime format for your iPod, or if you have iTunes installed, an MP3 audio-only version of the show, and a WMV HD version of the show, which you can download via BitTorrent that looks really, really clear and in pristine HD quality. And instructions for downloading via BitTorrent are also on the site. On the right-hand side, we have more information about us and about each of the members of the show, as well as quick links to all of our prior episodes and links to the RSS feeds for each of the formats that we release the show in, and links to subscribe to the show in iTunes if you have an iPod, an Apple TV, an iPhone, any Apple device. You can click on that link in either video or audio format. You can also in iTunes search for Tecker, T-E-C-K-E-R, in the iTunes store, and then you can find our podcast that you can subscribe to free. Also, if you do not have an iPod, if you have like a generic MP3 player, then you can use you can still listen to our show if on our website you subscribe to this MP3 audio version in a feed catcher, in a podcatcher like Juice. You can search for Juice on Google, download that program, and then it'll load the shows automatically onto your generic MP3 playing device. If you have any questions about the show or about technology, you can send us an email at 911@tecker.net, or you can leave us a voicemail at 610-572-2847. Thank you so much for watching Tecker 911.